The day began just like any other for Jamal. He had a meeting scheduled with his lawyer, but before heading to the office, he needed to stop by the local precinct to resolve an issue with some of his legal documents. Jamal was a successful businessman, one who had worked tirelessly to build his company from the ground up. He wasn't used to asking for help, but today, the circumstances were different. He needed these documents to be processed so he could move forward with his plans, and the best place to handle it was at the police station. As Jamal walked through the precinct doors, he tried to ignore the nerves creeping up inside him. It wasn't because he was intimidated by the police or the situation. Rather, it was because he knew that many people, especially those in positions of power, often looked at him differently because of his background. Being a black man, Jamal had often felt the sting of judgment and stereotypes. Still, he held his head high, determined not to let his appearance or background define him. The precinct was bustling with activity as officers worked on their various cases. The noise of phones ringing, papers shuffling, and people talking filled the air. Jamal approached the counter where Officer Collins, a man in his early 30s with a stern expression, was working. Collins was scanning through some paperwork when Jamal cleared his throat to get his attention. "Excuse me, sir. I need some help with my legal documents," Jamal said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the nerves he felt. Officer Collins looked up at Jamal, his expression unreadable at first. Jamal handed over the documents, his heart pounding slightly as he waited for the officer to take them. Collins barely glanced at the papers before giving Jamal a dismissive look. "These papers," Collins said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What do you need them for? People like you don't usually need these kinds of things." Jamal was taken aback by the comment but didn't let it show. He had encountered this kind of prejudice before, but had always chosen to rise above it. He didn't let his emotions get the best of him. Instead, he calmly explained the importance of the documents and why they were needed for a legal matter. But Officer Collins was uninterested in listening. He let out a small chuckle, almost mocking Jamal's request. "Really? A man like you dealing with paperwork like this? Sure, whatever," he muttered under his breath, clearly dismissing Jamal as someone who didn't belong in such situations. Before Jamal could respond, Collins grabbed the papers and, in a move that shocked him, set them on fire right there in front of him. The officer laughed as the flames began to consume the documents, completely oblivious to the magnitude of what he was doing. Jamal stood there frozen for a moment, watching the flames engulf the precious papers that held the key to his future. The sight was maddening. The officer, completely unaware of the consequences of his actions, laughed as if it was some sort of joke. Jamal's mind raced, but he stayed silent, refusing to let the officers see how deeply this hurt him. He knew he had to handle the situation carefully. After all, he was in a police station, and confrontation wasn't the answer. But deep down, he knew that this act was not just a mistake. It was a deliberate insult. What Jamal didn't realize, however, was that this encounter would change the course of his life forever. The officer's careless behavior, driven by ignorance and prejudice, would come back to haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. As Jamal turned to leave the precinct, his hands clenched into fists, and he made a vow to himself that he would take action. He wouldn't let this moment define him, but he would make sure it defined the person who thought they could treat him like that. What Jamal didn't know yet was that he wasn't just some man being mistreated in a police station. He was about to become the one in charge, and that officer, who had so carelessly destroyed his future, would soon learn just how wrong he had been. Jamal couldn't shake the image of his legal documents burning away in front of him. It was as though the officer had stripped away something important, something that meant the difference between moving forward or being held back. But Jamal was not one to stay down for long. He knew he couldn't just let this moment slide. He couldn't just forget the disrespect he had been shown. The drive home was long, and as Jamal stared out the window, his mind churned with a mix of anger and determination. He tried to think logically about the situation, tried to convince himself it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but the truth was, it was more than just the documents. It was the treatment, the mockery, the assumption that because of his appearance and background, he didn't belong in the places where important decisions were made. But Jamal had built himself up to be someone who could stand tall in any room, no matter who was there. That night, he spent hours on the phone with his lawyer, explaining what had happened at the precinct. They discussed how the documents could be replaced and how they could take legal action against the officer for his behavior. The lawyer, understanding how important this was to Jamal, immediately made arrangements to get the process started. But Jamal knew that legal action alone wouldn't be enough. There had to be a bigger consequence, something that would make people realize that they couldn't just treat him, or anyone else, like that without facing repercussions. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure that no one else would have to endure the same kind of mistreatment. Jamal understood that to make a real change, he would have to use his position and resources. He knew that if he stayed quiet, this kind of behavior would continue unchecked. But Jamal had a plan that would surprise not just Officer Collins, but everyone who doubted him. The next day, the news broke that the city was hiring new leaders for key positions in various precincts and organizations. The initiative was aimed at fostering change within local government and law enforcement, bringing in fresh perspectives. Jamal, who had always been active in his community, had been nominated to fill the position of precinct chief. He had worked tirelessly to build his reputation over the years, not just as a businessman, but as someone who cared deeply about justice and fairness. Jamal didn't hesitate to accept the offer. The announcement shocked many, including Officer Collins. The news spread quickly that the new precinct chief was none other than the man he had disrespected just days before. But what Officer Collins didn't know was that Jamal was now in a position to do something about it. Jamal wasn't just a victim in this story. He was the one who would have the final word. As Jamal prepared for his first day on the job, he thought about how best to approach the situation with Officer Collins. He didn't want to make it personal, but he also didn't want to let the officer's actions slide. He knew that this would be a chance to show not only the officer but everyone in the precinct what true leadership looked like. Jamal wasn't just going to step into his role and let the past go unaddressed. He had a bigger purpose in mind. It was time for change, and Jamal was ready to be the one to bring it. The days leading up to Jamal's first day as precinct chief were filled with a mixture of excitement and nerves. He knew the responsibility was immense, and the weight of the position was not lost on him. He wasn't just walking into a new job. He was walking into a role that would give him the power to shape the future of the precinct and influence the lives of many. But it wasn't just about the role itself. It was about the way he had been treated and the opportunity to right those wrongs. When Jamal arrived at the precinct for the first time as the new chief, he could feel the eyes of everyone on him. Officers, staff, and even the janitors who were busy cleaning in the corners of the building paused and stared. It was hard to miss the disbelief on their faces, especially after the announcement. They were all wondering how someone like him had ended up in this position. Jamal had always been aware of how people viewed him, especially in a professional environment. As a black man, he often had to work harder, prove himself more, and overcome hurdles that others didn't face. But he had always risen to the challenge. He had earned his place, and no one, not even Officer Collins, could take that away from him. Jamal walked confidently into his new office, ignoring the whispering and the looks. He didn't need to engage with the doubts of others. He was there to lead. He sat at the large desk that overlooked the precinct's bustling operations and took a deep breath. The reality of it all sank in, but he was ready. Soon enough, it was time for the staff meeting, and Jamal stood at the front of the room, prepared to make his first impression. He wasn't going to sugarcoat anything. He knew the precinct was going through a tough time. There had been complaints about a lack of accountability, and the trust between the community and the officers had been strained. It was time for change, and Jamal was the person to bring that change. As he spoke, Jamal made it clear that things would be different under his leadership. He outlined new initiatives aimed at improving relations with the community, increasing transparency, and holding every officer accountable for their actions. There was no room for complacency or ignorance anymore. He wanted to bring in new training programs, better communication, and a focus on empathy and fairness. Jamal made it clear that he wasn't just the chief. He was someone who was deeply invested in making sure everyone in that room upheld the values of integrity and respect. When the meeting was over, Jamal felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had made his intentions known, and now it was time to see if his actions would match his words. But what Jamal didn't know was that his first big test would come sooner than he expected. Officer Collins, the man who had burned his legal documents, was about to enter his office for a meeting. Jamal had already decided that he needed to address the officer's behavior, but he wasn't sure how the encounter would unfold. He had the power now, but would he use it wisely? Jamal looked out of the office window, taking a deep breath before standing up. He knew this moment was important, not just for him, but for the entire precinct. Officer Collins would be walking into that room soon, and Jamal would have to confront the man who had disrespected him. Unaware of how much things had changed, it was time to show Collins and everyone else that Jamal was no longer someone to be underestimated. He was in charge now, and he was ready to make his mark. The door to Jamal's office creaked open, and in walked Officer Collins. He had no idea what to expect when he was called into the new chief's office, but as he stepped into the room, he was greeted by Jamal's steady gaze. The air between them felt thick, as though the moment had been building up for days. Jamal sat behind his desk, calm and collected, his posture confident. Collins, on the other hand, was tense, clearly unsure of how to act in front of someone he had once dismissed so easily. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Collins hesitated, his eyes flicking from Jamal to the chair in front of the desk. He had expected to be met with hostility, or at least some kind of resistance, but instead, Jamal simply gestured for him to sit. Reluctantly, Collins took the seat, his mind racing with questions. How had Jamal gone from a random man in the precinct to the chief of the entire station? How had this happened so quickly, and why was he still here? Jamal took a deep breath before speaking, his voice calm but firm. Officer Collins, I'm sure you've heard by now that I'm the new chief of this precinct, but there's something that needs to be addressed. Something that happened not long ago. Collins stiffened in his chair, the weight of Jamal's words settling over him. He knew exactly what Jamal was referring to, and for the first time, he felt a twinge of guilt. The incident with the legal documents seemed so insignificant at the time, but now, in the presence of the man who had become his superior, it felt like a serious mistake. Jamal continued, his gaze never leaving Collins's. I'm sure you remember the day I came into the precinct with those legal papers. You saw me as just another man who didn't belong in this kind of situation, someone you could belittle without consequence. Collins opened his mouth to say something, but Jamal raised a hand to stop him. I know what you did. I saw the way you mocked me. I saw you burn my documents like they were nothing. Collins shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face reddening. He hadn't expected this confrontation. He had expected the new chief to be just like the others, maybe a little more formal, but nothing too different. He had never imagined that the man he had humiliated would be the one holding all the cards now. It was a harsh realization, and one that Collins wasn't sure how to handle. Jamal's voice softened but remained strong. You might have thought I wasn't important enough for you to treat me with respect. You probably thought I was just another person to push around, someone who would never rise above what you saw on the surface. But you were wrong. There was a pause, as Jamal let his words sink in. I'm here now. And the way you treated me that day isn't something I'm willing to forget. The silence in the room was thick. Jamal's words weren't just a reprimand. They were a reminder that respect and decency mattered more than rank, more than power. Collins sat there, stunned. He had no excuses, no way to justify his actions. He had underestimated Jamal, and now he had to face the consequences of that mistake. Jamal leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Collins. I didn't come here today to tear you down, But I need you to understand that actions like that have consequences. And in this precinct, everyone will be held accountable, no matter who they are or where they come from. Collins felt a lump form in his throat. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he apologize for something so careless, so thoughtless? There was no easy way to fix this, no quick solution. The damage had been done, and now it was up to him to prove that he had learned from his mistakes. Jamal stood up, his voice steady as he concluded, "We all make mistakes, but the key is learning from them and moving forward. I expect nothing less from you, Officer Collins." With that, Jamal turned toward the door, signaling that the meeting was over. Collins sat there for a moment, taking in everything that had been said. He had come into the room thinking he could control the situation, but now he realized that Jamal had already taken control. And for the first time, he felt the weight of the change that had come to the precinct. As the days passed, the atmosphere at the precinct began to shift. Jamal's presence was undeniable. He wasn't just another officer in charge. He was someone who understood the value of respect, responsibility, and accountability. The precinct was filled with whispers, some of disbelief, others of admiration. People were starting to realize that Jamal's leadership wasn't like anything they had experienced before. He wasn't there to create fear or to demand respect. Instead, he worked with the officers, creating an environment where they were held to the highest standards, but also supported when they needed it. Despite the changes Jamal was making, there were still some who weren't fully convinced. Officer Collins, for one, struggled with the idea of Jamal being in charge. He had come from a world where his authority had rarely been questioned. He was used to the idea of power being unquestioned, and Jamal's approach, which included open dialogue and an emphasis on mutual respect, was foreign to him. At first, Collins tried to resist the change, still holding on to the belief that Jamal's background, his race, somehow made him unfit for the role. But with every passing day, Jamal's methods proved more effective. The precinct was running more smoothly than it ever had. The officers were working together in ways they hadn't before, and the community began to notice the difference. People were more willing to trust the officers now that Jamal was leading them. He had a way of getting people to listen, not by intimidating them, but by showing them that their work mattered and that they were all part of a team. Collins was still struggling. He had been forced to apologize in front of the entire precinct after his actions, but it didn't sit well with him. He had spent years believing that his position gave him the right to act however he pleased, without consequences. But now, under Jamal's leadership, the rules had changed. It wasn't about what rank you held, it was about what kind of person you were. And that was something Collins had to come to terms with. One afternoon, Jamal called a meeting of all the officers in the precinct. He had a new initiative in mind, one that would improve relationships with the community even further. It was a program that would encourage officers to work more closely with local schools, helping students understand the importance of law enforcement in a positive, supportive way. Jamal explained that the goal wasn't just to prevent crime, but to build bridges and earn the trust of those they served. During the meeting, Jamal spoke about the importance of empathy and understanding. He talked about his own experiences growing up and how he had always felt like he had to prove himself to be worthy of respect. "I know what it's like to be underestimated," Jamal said, his voice strong but steady. "And I know how much it means when someone believes in you. Our job is to show the people we serve that we believe in them too." The room fell silent as the officers took in Jamal's words. Collins, sitting near the back, felt a twinge of something he hadn't felt before: admiration. He was starting to realize that Jamal wasn't just a leader in name. He was a leader in action. He didn't need to shout or demand respect. He earned it. And that, Collins thought, was something worth striving for. After the meeting, Jamal made a point to approach Collins. He had noticed the change in the officer's demeanor over the past few days. The resistance was still there, but it was weakening. "How do you feel about the new initiative?" Jamal asked, his tone friendly but professional. Collins hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice quieter than usual. "It sounds like a good idea," he admitted. "I think it could make a difference." Jamal smiled, a small but knowing smile. It was clear that Collins was starting to see the value in what he was doing. He wasn't completely there yet, but Jamal was patient. He knew that change didn't happen overnight. As Jamal walked away, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had no illusions that everyone in the precinct was fully on board with his vision yet, but he had made progress. The hard work was just beginning, but he was ready for it. He wasn't just in charge of a precinct. He was in charge of shaping a new culture, one based on fairness, trust, and mutual respect. And Jamal was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. As the weeks passed, Jamal's leadership continued to leave a significant impact on the precinct. The officers began to work together more effectively, and the once rigid and hierarchical atmosphere softened. Jamal wasn't just a figurehead. He was genuinely invested in making the precinct a better place for everyone. His approach was simple but powerful: accountability, communication, and empathy. His focus on these principles helped to break down the walls that had existed between the officers and the community they served. One afternoon, Jamal was sitting in his office, reviewing some reports from the community outreach programs the precinct had been running. It was clear that the programs were having a positive effect, and the relationships between officers and local residents were improving. People were starting to feel more comfortable reaching out to the police, knowing they were being treated with respect. Jamal smiled as he read the feedback from the community members who had attended the precinct's new community events, grateful for the progress being made. Just as he was about to make a few notes, the door to his office opened, and Officer Collins stepped inside. He had been quieter than usual in recent days, and Jamal had noticed a subtle shift in his behavior. The once arrogant officer was now carrying himself with a bit more humility, his demeanor less defensive. It was clear that something had changed, but Jamal wasn't sure what exactly had sparked the change. "Good afternoon, Chief," Collins said, his tone polite but still reserved. "Afternoon, officer," Jamal replied, looking up from his desk. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, have a seat. What's on your mind?" Collins hesitated for a moment before sitting down, looking at his hands before meeting Jamal's gaze. "I wanted to talk to you about something that's been bothering me," he began, his voice quieter than usual. Jamal leaned back in his chair, giving Collins his full attention. "Of course. What's going on?" Collins took a deep breath before speaking again, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about the way I treated you when you first came in. I was out of line. I didn't take you seriously, and I certainly didn't show you the respect you deserve." Jamal didn't say anything right away. He just sat there, waiting for Collins to continue. "The truth is," Collins continued, his voice tinged with regret, "I didn't think someone like you could understand what it's like in this line of work. I thought I could get away with things, but honestly, you've made me realize how wrong I was." He paused, looking down at the floor for a moment, as if trying to gather his thoughts. "I've learned a lot since then. I see things differently now, and I wanted to apologize." The room was quiet for a moment as Jamal absorbed Collins's words. It wasn't easy for the officer to admit his mistakes, and Jamal could tell that he was genuine in his apology. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, just honesty. Jamal sat forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate your apology, Collins. It's not easy to admit when we've made mistakes, but it's a crucial step in growing as individuals and as professionals. We all have our moments where we slip up, but what matters is what we do after that." Collins nodded, relieved to hear Jamal's response. "I get that now. I really do." Jamal smiled, nodding in understanding. "We all make mistakes. What's important is learning from them. And Collins, I can see you're trying to make things right. That means a lot to me." There was a brief silence before Jamal stood up from his desk, signaling that the conversation was coming to a close. He extended his hand to Collins. "Let's move forward from here, together." Collins stood up as well, his hand reaching out to shake Jamal's. The handshake was firm, and for the first time, there was no tension between them, just mutual respect. It was a turning point, not just for Collins, but for Jamal as well. He had seen a man who once resisted change come around, slowly but surely, to understand the importance of humility and accountability. As Collins left the office, Jamal sat back down at his desk, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The precinct wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done. But this moment, this exchange between him and Collins, showed him that change was possible. It wasn't always quick, and it wasn't always easy, but it was happening. And for Jamal, that was the most important thing. His leadership wasn't about asserting power or authority. It was about inspiring others to become better versions of themselves. Jamal had set out to change the culture of the precinct, and while there was still a long way to go, today had shown him that he was on the right path. People were listening. They were learning. And with each step forward, Jamal knew that they were all making progress. As the weeks passed, Jamal's efforts to transform the precinct continued to gain momentum. His leadership, which focused on accountability and understanding, was beginning to show real results. Officers were more cooperative, the community was feeling more engaged, and even those who had once doubted him were slowly beginning to see the change. Jamal had not only gained their respect, but had earned the trust of the people they served. The precinct was slowly becoming a place where both officers and civilians could feel safe, heard, and valued. Still, Jamal knew that change wasn't something that happened overnight. It required patience, persistence, and, at times, hard decisions. He was fully aware that there were still those who were uncomfortable with the shift in power and those who resisted his methods. But Jamal was determined to continue down the path he had set. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he was more committed than ever to seeing it through. One morning, as Jamal walked into the precinct, he was greeted with a new challenge, one that he hadn't expected. It was the beginning of a new initiative aimed at improving relationships with the community, and Jamal was about to face the first real test of how deeply his changes had taken hold. The precinct was hosting a community event, where officers would meet with local residents in an informal setting, allowing them to interact and build stronger connections. While Jamal had hoped this would be a positive experience, he had been warned that some of the officers were still hesitant about engaging with the public in such a personal way. As the event began, Jamal stood at the front, watching the officers greet the residents. Some of them appeared to be unsure of how to approach the situation, glancing nervously at each other as they spoke with the locals. But Jamal was determined to lead by example. He moved through the crowd, smiling and greeting everyone he came across. He took time to chat with people, asking about their day, their families, and their concerns. His friendly approach immediately began to break down the barriers that had previously existed between the police and the community. As he walked toward a group of officers who were gathered near a table, Jamal could see that one officer, Sergeant Walker, was standing off to the side, avoiding eye contact with the residents. Walker had been one of the officers who had initially resisted Jamal's leadership, and it was clear that he was still struggling to fully embrace the changes. Jamal made his way over to him and stood by his side for a moment, observing the situation. "Hey, Walker," Jamal said with a friendly tone. "You okay?" Walker hesitated for a moment before responding, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know, Chief. I just don't know how to talk to these people. It feels different." Jamal nodded, understanding where Walker was coming from. He had seen this hesitation in others before, and he knew it would take time for the officers to feel truly comfortable in this new environment. "I get it. But look around. These people are just like us. They want the same things: safety, respect, and understanding. All we have to do is listen." For a moment, Walker stood silently, taking in Jamal's words. He watched as Jamal walked over to a group of residents, engaging with them as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Jamal's approach was warm and genuine, and it wasn't long before the group of residents seemed to relax, laughing and chatting with him as if they had known him for years. Walker watched from the sidelines, still unsure, but something in Jamal's demeanor made him reconsider. He had seen Jamal's strength and confidence over the past few weeks, but now he saw something else. Kindness. It was an approach that wasn't about power, but about connecting with people. Walker's unease slowly began to melt away as he took another look at the group of residents and realized that they weren't looking at him as an officer, they were looking at him as a person. With a deep breath, Walker stepped forward and joined the conversation. At first, he was quiet, but Jamal noticed the small but significant change. The more Walker engaged with the residents, the more comfortable he became. Soon, he was laughing along with the others and sharing stories of his own. It was a turning point for him, one that Jamal had hoped would happen. By the end of the event, Walker had transformed from a hesitant officer to someone who truly understood the value of community engagement. As the event came to a close, Jamal stood back, watching his officers interact with the community. It was clear that things were changing. The once awkward conversations had turned into meaningful exchanges, and the divide between the officers and the people they served was beginning to shrink. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The following weeks were a period of reflection and transformation for both Jamal and the precinct. What had started as a difficult journey filled with skepticism and doubt had slowly blossomed into a model of what real leadership could achieve. Jamal had witnessed firsthand the growth of his officers and the shift in the precinct's dynamics. People were no longer just following orders. They were becoming a team, working together to create a safer and more connected community. Jamal had always believed that leadership was about more than just giving orders. It was about inspiring others to find their best selves. And that was exactly what had begun to happen in the precinct. He wasn't just an authority figure. He was someone who led by example, who made others believe that they could be better than they were. He made it clear that being an officer wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about making a real difference in people's lives. One afternoon, as Jamal was walking through the precinct, he overheard a conversation between two officers. It was a simple conversation, but it stopped him in his tracks. One officer was speaking about how they had helped a local child with a school project, and the other officer was sharing how they had assisted a single mother in the community with finding resources for her family. These were the kinds of stories Jamal had hoped to hear, the kind of positive interactions he had envisioned for the precinct when he first took charge. It wasn't about arresting people or cracking down on crime. It was about helping the people who needed it the most. Jamal smiled to himself. The change was becoming more than just an idea. It was becoming a reality. His officers were no longer just enforcing the law. They were part of the community, helping to build something stronger and more trusting. That evening, Jamal sat down at his desk, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The hard work was far from over, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in how far they had come. There were still many challenges to face, and there were still people who doubted whether true change was possible. But Jamal knew one thing: they had already started down the right path, and there was no turning back. The phone rang, breaking his train of thought. It was a local community leader who had been involved in some of the outreach programs Jamal had initiated. The conversation was filled with praise for the changes happening at the precinct and how the community was beginning to feel more at ease with the officers. Jamal thanked the leader for their support, but it was clear to him that the success wasn't just his. It was shared by everyone who had come together to make it happen. The officers, the community, and the local leaders were all part of this transformation. As the conversation ended, Jamal took a deep breath. He knew the journey would continue, with new challenges and new opportunities, but he had learned something crucial along the way. Change was possible, and sometimes all it took was the right person, with the right vision, to make it happen. The precinct was no longer just a place where officers worked. It had become a place where trust, respect, and understanding were at the core of everything they did. It wasn't perfect, but the progress was undeniable. Jamal had not only earned the respect of his officers, but had earned the respect of the community. He had turned an environment of distrust into one of collaboration, and that was something worth celebrating. As Jamal looked out the window of his office, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He knew the future was still uncertain, and there would be days when the challenges seemed insurmountable. But he also knew that as long as they stayed focused on the values of empathy, fairness, and accountability, they would continue to move forward together. The precinct was no longer just a place of authority. It was a place where everyone, no matter their background, could find common ground. And as Jamal walked out of his office that evening, ready to face whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure: the best was yet to come.